So I was saying that there was sort of a dip in the Viking invasions, that after about mm, 873, there was kind of a lack of Vikings appearing in the Irish annals. We don't really know a lot what was going on. And this was right after Dublin and York had ended up kind of uniting, and so we had sort of this Viking Northman empire that they had created across Ireland and Northumbria. But Ivar, the king of York, had died in 876 or 873. And it was after that death that we kind of see kind of a retreat of the Vikings in the records, and apparently a retreat in the Vikings from Ireland in general. But in 914, there is a revival of Viking raids into Ireland, and it's really kind of amped up. In 914, we see the arrival of a very large fleet of Viking ships, and they retake Waterford, and they are reinforced by a second fleet the following year, so in 915. And together, these two fleets are able to really kind of penetrate deeper into Ireland, into Munster, and then into Leinster. And this is where we see them reestablishing their trading cities in Dublin, as well as Waterford and then Wexford. We see them founding the cities of Limerick, which is right at the mouth of the River Shannon, so it's a really important area as well. But we also see them retaking Dublin and building it up more. So I think this is where I stopped last time, so I'm going to start there. I was discussing quite a bit yesterday about how the Vikings interacted with the Irish in different ways than they interacted with, say, the English or the Scottish or even the French or the Normans that they interacted with. In Ireland, because of the political structure, they just weren't as able to control large swaths of land, like agricultural land. In Ireland, they really were limited to their control over certain port cities and like the very near surrounding areas. And that's really kind of unique within Ireland. And partly because of this and this focus on these port cities, we see the Vikings in Ireland concentrating far more on developing Dublin and these other port cities than they have in conquering territory into the interior. So in its day, Dublin was one of the most important cities in the Nordic world. Its role within the trading and the slaving center of this northern kind of trading empire was very important. And in fact, for a while, Dublin was the largest slave port in Western Europe. It was an important port. Sorry, it was an important port in the trade routes that extended from Constantinople to the Mediterranean to Norway to Iceland. So it was a good stepping off point. By 950, so about 35 years after the revival of Viking interest in Ireland, the Vikings stopped raiding Ireland for the most part. Instead, they really developed as traders and settlers in those towns and port cities that they established. So we don't see these scattered raiding attacks on the coastlines of Ireland, and we don't see these giant fleets penetrating up the rivers and attacking inland cities. It's far more of a settlement and developing what they've got that we see. So the Vikings start intermarrying with the local Irish nobility. Obviously, if they're nobles themselves, they do that. But we also see intermarriage on very local, poor levels as well. They're trading goods with the Irish. They're exchanging culture. We see a blending of arts and crafts. So there is a very unique type of style that develops in Dublin, sort of an artwork style that's a nice blend of Norse and then with Irish style. So you have that knotwork, but it's like knotwork representing the Norse gods. And so it's a really interesting blend that we see going on at this time. And so the cities that they did found, so we're talking about Wexford and Waterford and Limerick, these cities really start to develop in ways, so they were not connected to a monastery or to a religious site. And so they are truly a trading city, a hub that the Vikings have created. And those cities are now linked to this greater European trading network. And so we do see a lot of kind of cosmopolitan exchanges that are going on, and people from various places around Europe have been found to be living in Dublin at various times during this Viking era. So there is quite a bit of that cultural exchange that's happening. And some of these more settled Vikings that have been more established in these cities start to become known as Hiberno Norse. At least within the sources, we start referring to them as Hiberno Norse because they really are this blend, even perhaps even generations at this point of Norse and Irish families blending together. So this Hiberno Norse is really starting to develop at this point too. And as I said, they're known for their craftsmanship and kind of this unique blending of craftsmanship, but also for the fighting skills. So they're blending fighting styles together. Traditionally, many Vikings were farmers when they weren't out raiding. And when you're farming on a farmstead, especially in the Nordic regions of Norway, that the majority of the Vikings that we think came to Ireland came from, you have to have a lot of different crafts and skills being kind of on an independent, isolated homestead. And so we see these Vikings coming into Ireland with a variety of kind of low-level skills like blacksmithing, metalworking, weaving, even jewelry making. And so we see those craft skills being incorporated into these port cities, and we start to see this development of various artisan class, whereas the city itself is able to attract enough agricultural goods and various food items to support themselves, allowing these independent craftsmen to focus on their art rather than having to work in a field to also scrape together their food. So it's kind of this development of a merchant class as well as an artisan class in these cities. So the Viking tale, I just want to see where I am here. So the Viking tale in Ireland finally does sort of take a turn, a downturn, sort of its final downslide from where it had peaked. And it turns down around the end of the 10th century CE. And so it begins with the current king of Dublin. So the Viking king of Dublin, he's known as Olaf Sidriksson. Now, he was also the king of York because when our various rulers came in, when Cedric the Squinty and Ragnar, when they reconquered Dublin, they were reconquering it for those kings of York. And so we still have this connection between York and Ireland. So Olaf Sidriksson is the king of Dublin. And he was really quite confident and maybe a bit too overconfident. And he had conquest on his mind. So remember, around 950, we really don't see that much Viking raiding into the interior of Ireland. And he kind of wanted to change that. So he starts going into open battle against various of the Irish nobles that are nearby. So he actually engages in a pitched battle with the King of Leinster, and he defeats the King of Leinster. And to kind of seal this peace treaty, Olaf Sidriksson marries one of the king's daughters. He marries this princess named Gormaith, or Gormlaith. And Gormlaith is a very interesting character, and we're going to see her pop up in quite a few different times. I have her name down here on the slide, Princess Gormlaith. And so she married this Viking king in a marriage deal to sort of seal this peace treaty. And so after Olaf had defeated the King of Leinster, he continues to kind of overreach and kind of attack some of these other Irish targets. But he overreached too much when he went into a pitched battle against the kingdom of Meath in a battle known as the Battle of Tara in 980. So this battle is known as the Red Slaughter because it was quite a brutal battle. Now, the current king of Meath is Mal Schnall, which we may remember that name because his great-grandfather was a king of Meath when the Vikings first started raiding. So this is a long line of kings. Now, Mal Schnall was the king of Meath, and his great-grandfather had been the ruler of Meath, who had drowned that ruler who founded Dublin, Turgus. He had drowned him after a loss at Clonmanoise. So Mal is able to defeat this Olaf Sidriksson in open battle. and he is able to then march his troops down to London, and he successfully takes Dublin back from these Viking rulers. Their leader, the king, is dead. Olaf Sidriksson is dead. And he allows the other Vikings who are living in Dublin to remain in Dublin because they're good for trade. They're bringing in a lot of commerce and a lot of tax money. And so that's obviously good. Excuse me for a second. But he agreed to let the Vikings stay there if they pay him tribute. They free all of the O'Neill lands that they had conquered previously, and that they free all of the Irish slaves that are being held in bondage in Dublin. They don't care about the other slaves, just the Irish slaves are no longer able to be held in bondage by these Vikings. To seal up this deal, Mal Schnall actually marries the widow of Olaf Sidriksson, and so he marries Gormlaith now. So Gormlaith went from being a princess of Leinster to being the queen of Dublin, married to a Viking king, to now being married to the king of Meath. So it's, you can see where some of these marriages can be used as these peace treaties quite a bit. So other Viking cities besides Dublin are starting to get a little bit more involved in the politics of the local Irish tuas and kings that are in those areas. The Viking rulers, for the most part, when they're getting involved in these skirmishes, even if they're defeated, they're allowed to stay in place and to continue doing their business from those cities that they founded. Because again, much like the King of Meath noticed, is that the Irish overlords knew that these port cities run by the Vikings were sources of income and power, and sacking them was only going to be harming the king's ability to make money later on. So even if the Vikings are defeated, they're allowed to remain in the country because of the commerce and the international trade that they bring to Ireland, which again, we did not have before the Vikings settled. Okay. So we're going to move now to kind of a slightly different topic. We're going to move away from Dublin for a minute. So as I mentioned, the King of Meath, as he is growing in power, as that O'Neill clan is growing in power, there is another important family out of Munster that's growing in power, and this is the Dál Keys clan, who resided in the Shannon Basin area in northern Munster. So kind of, if you look at the map, they're located a lot right in this area, so northern Munster. And during this time period, they are able to increase their dominance in this province because the O'Neills had inadvertently, through their own power struggles, managed to weaken some of the rivals for the Dál Keys in their area. So they were able to benefit from the power of the O'Neill clans, kind of holding down some of these other family clans. And now the Dál Keys were helped by the fact that the Shannon River was really growing in importance through the Viking trade that developed in Limerick at the mouth of the Shannon. In 976, we do have the king, or the lord of the Dál Keys. His name is Mathgamon. He's the lord of the Dál Keys. He is actually assassinated by the kings of Limerick. I don't know why he was actually assassinated. I'm going to assume it was just part of regular politics at this time, just sort of that back and forth. And part of the reason why it's confusing is that these Limerick Vikings had actually converted to Christianity, so it wasn't a religious debate. And they ruled this territory around Limerick for quite some time at this point. And so this assassination was a little out of the blue. And although it happened in the center of Munster, as I said, these Vikings were tolerated to remain in Limerick because they brought little trouble and they brought quite a bit of trade. But this political assassination really kind of changed the Irish perspective of these particular Vikings. So when the brother of this king that was assassinated, when his brother Brian succeeded him to become the Lord of Dál Keys, Brian wasted little time in getting retribution, getting that blood feud against these Vikings taken care of. So he was motivated by a desire for revenge for his brother's death, but also seeing the city of Limerick being quite a nice target and a lot of money coming out of that. Brian saw that as a way of gaining greater authority and power. So his first action, once he was confirmed on the throne, was to attack these Vikings of Limerick. So the king currently in Limerick was King Aymar of Limerick. And he and his sons took refuge in a monastery on Scattery Island. And normally, like I said, these Vikings have now converted to Christianity, so they understand that other Christians respect sanctuary, they respect these Christian holy sites, and so they knew that, and that's why they sought refuge at this monastery. However, Brian did not respect that sanctuary, and he followed these Vikings into the monastery, broke into it, and he slaughtered the Vikings. And apparently there was some desecration of the church as well, but I wasn't able to find elaborate and reliable details on this desecration. But it may have just been, it was desecrated because the sanctuary had been violated. That is usually enough for it. But we see that the Vikings are starting to acclimate and they understand these Christian laws. So it's interesting that they sought refuge there. So Brian is victorious over these Vikings. And by 980, so a few years after his, about 4 years after his brother was killed and he took the throne, by 980, he was able to have himself crowned as the king of Munster. So within a very short time period, he was able to rise from being a local lord, a local ree, to a higher level of king. And he starts to form a strategic alliance with the Vikings at Waterford. So remember, he's taken over Limerick, so the Vikings there are not going to ally with him if there's any left. So he makes an alliance with the Vikings in Waterford, which again, this is not very unusual because at this point, the Vikings and the Irish that are living there, these Hiberno Norse, are really getting involved in internal politics and becoming just another clan in a lot of senses. So Waterford and Brian unite together, and together they pool their resources. So the Vikings have a lot of reliable ships, and Brian's army has a lot of reliable fighters, and so together they're able to penetrate deep into Connacht with Brian's land forces, and then with the Vikings boats as a way of kind of naval support as well as strategic supplies and other support. And so once Brian is feeling comfortable with his dominance over Munster, he goes beyond Connacht and he starts putting pressure on other kings in other areas that border Munster and Connacht at this point. And one of those areas is Leinster, which eventually he's able to kind of put under the thumb and kind of dominate and sort of create an alliance with them as well. So now they are looking to Brian as a high king at this point. And at this point, we probably realize that I'm talking about Brian Boru, this mythical, exciting king of Ireland. But he's not known as Brian Boru at this point in this time. At this point in time that we're talking about, so I didn't want to use that word yet. But I thought I should reveal the secret sooner rather than later. So now that Munster has become militarily and politically aggressive, and that these campaigns under Brian have started to go further afield, where they've started dominating Leinster, they've started working their way into Connacht as well. It's not a surprise that they're starting to be brought into conflict with Mal Schnall, the king of Meath, who is currently recognized as the High King of Tara. Again, he's not necessarily recognized as everyone, but by the lands in Meath and the lands in Ulster that he's in charge of, he's recognized as the High King there. But it's not a surprise that Brian, now that he's gaining in importance, is coming into conflict with another very important king in Ireland. And Mal Schnall's power base is in the Midlands of Ireland. So again, it's pretty close to Leinster and Munster as you start pushing north. And now this king, Mal Schnall, as I just said, he was the king of Meath that defeated Olaf Sidriksson, the Viking king of Dublin, and he had then married his widow. So Mal Schnall and the O'Neill clan become increasingly alarmed at the rise of this King Brian. And Mal actually ends up leading several armies against Brian. and they fight a number of different battles. There are some that they win, there are some that they lose, but this experience for Brian, he's actually able to really build off of it. So in fighting against these Hiberno-Norse troops and these other Irish enemies, Brian is able to develop a really highly effective military strategy that involves both this employing land forces as well as the naval forces. So he's really kind of taking the strengths of both the Irish and the Viking allies that he has, and putting them to good use. So for coastal and river aspects, Brian would use these Hiberno-Norse allies, and then he would use his Irish forces on the land. So again, pulling from each strength. Now, in 997, Maul, Schnall, and Brian agree that they're both quite powerful, and fighting against each other to try to assert dominance is really just going to weaken both groups. So Maul, Schnall, and Brian agree to establish separate spheres of influence across Ireland. So the northern, it's essentially Ireland gets split with the north and the southern halves. Not like the split that we have now with Ulster being part of Britain. It's a little bit further. It's a little bit more of a north-south, kind of an equal divide. But at this point, this is when Brian Boru gets that name, Boru. He's effectively seen as this high king of at least half of Ireland. And so he's in charge of Munster, Leinster. He has control of Dublin. And then Maul, Schnall retains the allegiances of Meath and Ulster and the areas of Connaught that Brian had not kind of brought into Munster himself. Now, part of this agreement that Brian becomes the High King of these various areas that I just listed off, it does effectively put the King of Leinster out of business. He's no longer the High King of his area. He now has a High King that he has to conform to and he has to submit to. So this King of Leinster and his successor that we're going to be dealing with more, the successor is known as Maul Morda. And Maul Morda and his father go into open rebellion against Brian Boru because they don't want to submit to him. They hadn't really, they had allied with him after having lost some battles, but they didn't feel like they had completely submitted, nor had they agreed to this idea of calling Brian their High King. So Mal Morda, who is now, because his father at some point in this time period has passed. So Mal Morda, the King of Leinster, goes into open rebellion against Brian Boru. And he gets his nephew, Cedric Silkenbeard, who is now the Viking King of Dublin, to follow him. So just to kind of put some family ties here to make some connections. Mal Morda is the son of the King of Leinster. His sister is Gormaith, who is the woman who was married to the Viking King of Dublin, and then when he was killed in battle against Maul Schnall, she then married Maul Schnall. So this nephew of Mal Morda is actually the child of Gormlaith and Olaf Sidricson. So Cedric Silkenbeard is half Irish, half Norse. He is the grandson of the King of Leinster. He's the nephew of the present King of Leinster. But he's also a Christian, and he's very well read, and he speaks several languages, and so he's everything a Viking should be, according to those qualities that we read earlier yesterday. So at this point, Gormlaith, his mother, this former Princess of Leinster, former Queen of Dublin, and Maul MacMorda's sister, she is currently married to Maul Schnall, the King of Meath and Ulster. But at some point, those two end up getting a divorce. Remember, that's a pretty common thing that happens at this time, where you get married for a political alliance, and then when that time has passed, you get a divorce and you marry another for a political alliance. So Gormlaith is technically single at this point. And in the stories and the sagas that we have that talk about this time period, Gormlaith really gets painted in this really dark light. She kind of becomes a bit of a Lady Macbeth, or not an Eve necessarily, but just she instigates a lot of chaos, or at least that's the storyline that we're told by some of these chroniclers. We don't really know for sure, but she's blamed for this open rebellion being brought against Brian Boru at this point. Um, so undeterred by these Leinstermen and these Dublin Vikings revolting against him, Brian Boru brings up his armies, all of his Munster men, all of those men from Leinster that he had kind of taken under his wing previously, and all of his Viking allies. He actually marches them into Leinster to fight this rebellion. And he soundly defeats the King of Leinster, this Mal Morda, and his nephew, Cedric Silkenbeard. And he defeats them soundly at a battle that's called Glen Mama. And so after this defeat in this battle, Brian then descends on Dublin itself, which is actually in the winter, which is an unusual time for warfare to be happening in Ireland. But obviously the circumstances lent itself to these to battling at this point. And so he descends on Dublin in the middle of winter when maybe they weren't expecting to be attacked. And he attacks their defenses. He plunders the city and he burns down the fortress that had been built. But again, he doesn't damage the whole city. He doesn't massacre everyone because, again, those advantages to this international trading city are just too good to pass up. So Brian doesn't destroy the city completely. It's this huge port. It's a considerable international trade in slaves. And it's also the main conduit for foreign goods entering Ireland. So if he had destroyed all of Dublin, he might not have had access to pepper or to spices or maybe to different sorts of fabrics and things like that. So there was a benefit to him not sacking Dublin completely. So it's in Brian's interest to control the city, not to destroy it. So when Cedric Silkenbeard, who had fled the defeat at this Battle of Glen Mama, when he returns to Dublin, Brian accepts his submission in exchange for Cedric being allowed to be king of Dublin again, but recognizing Brian as his overlord, so making it kind of official. Brian even allowed Mal Morda, the king of Leinster, to reclaim that kingship under similar circumstances. So again, he's allowing these people to continue in their roles as long as they're willing to submit to him, offer him hostages, offer him tribute. In fact, one of the reasons why Brian Boru is known as Brian Boru is Boru means he of the cattle tributes, and so he was taking so much cattle, so many herds of cattle in tribute from all of his different lands that kind of gives him this moniker, this name of Brian Boru. And so after the King of Leinster, this Mal Morda, and Cedric Silkenbeard, the King of Dublin, after they submit to Brian, we see about a decade, about 10 years or so, where Ireland is kind of pretty harmonious at this point. We don't see any rebellions going on between Leinster and Dublin against Brian's rule. And at this point is when Brian really starts to exert his authority over other places in Ireland. And part of the reason he's able to do this is because he's able to exploit Dublin's economic and military and naval resources in a way that he had not really had access before this rebellion. So by 1002, Mal Schnall, the king of Meath, who is the recognized kind of high king in that northern half of Ireland. Remember, Brian took the southern half and Mal Schnall took the northern half. By 1002, Mal Schnall sees that there's no way that he can fight against Brian anymore. He just doesn't have that power or those resources. So he submits to Brian Boru, which essentially makes Brian the king over all of Ireland. So he's recognized as the High King of Tara, the High King of all of Ireland. And once this happens, he's able to really kind of a little bit more safely travel within Ireland and assert his authority in various points that he had maybe not been able to touch before. So he makes 2 circuits of the island in 1005 and then 1006, where he really penetrates deeply into the reaches of the O'Neill areas in Ulster, as well as some of those northern areas of Connaught as well. So he leads some of these campaigns, and he does have to go into battle against some of these other lords who aren't willing to recognize him as High King. So in 1011, his army goes into battle against the one remaining independent power. This is King Kenil Kane. King, I wonder if I have him on the slide. I don't have him on the slide here, but he's the king of Donegal, and he's the last king that is refusing to recognize Brian Boru as High King. So in 1011, Brian is able to conquer this one last king of Donegal, make him his vassal, and sealing the deal on his high kingship of Ireland at this point. And he's able to exercise more authority and control over Ireland than any previous High King of Ireland had ever been able to do previously. And part of this is because of the connectivity that the Vikings brought to Ireland at this time, that the international trade had created road systems, it had created communication systems in a way that the Irish had not been able to take advantage of previously. And so his control over Ireland at this time is definitely benefits from the Viking Age having already happened in Ireland. So Brian Boru is High King for nearly 15 years, where he goes unchallenged from about 1002 to about 1014. So he's unchallenged for about 12 years or so. And I'm going to go to the next slide here. But obviously, not all good things can last. But when the King of Leinster, when Mal Morda had made peace with Brian in 999, Brian, to seal this deal, had married Mal Morda's sister and Cedric's mother, Gormlaith. So now Gormlaith has been married to a King of Dublin, the King of Meath, and now she is married to the High King of Ireland as well. So Gormlaith has been a political pawn, or if you want to believe some of the chronicles about her, more of a seductress who works in the background. But she's definitely been used as sort of a peace treaty pawn between these Irish and Viking interactions that are going on at this time. But also, on the other hand, when Gormlaith married Brian, her son Cedric, Silkenbeard, married one of Brian's daughters. Her name was Slain. So he marries one of Brian's daughters. So we kind of have an exchange of relatives and essentially an exchange of hostages, too, if you want to look at it a little bit more bleakly. And these marriages are part of the reason why Silkenbeard supports Brian for a decade or more without there being any pushback from Cedric. So these marriages were really important. And however, as we've already talked about, normal Celtic Irish custom, marriage and divorce are pretty common. As I said, they are serial monogamists. So in regular custom, after about 15 years, Brian ends up divorcing Gormlaith so that he can form a new marriage. And this time he's going after the King of Connacht, and he's marrying that king's daughter. So again, to sort of seal that control that Brian Boru has over Connacht, he's going to marry one of that local king's daughters. And so the stories that talk about Gormlaith really kind of say that this is the turning point for her, that, you know, it was this divorce that shamed her. But I think we've made it pretty clear that divorce in Ireland at this point isn't really shameful. It's a normal part of Irish politics. And Gormlaith is Irish. She was born to the Irish king of Leinster, so she's not a foreigner. So this is her culture. So I don't really think that she was insulted by this divorce. It was just part of the normal part. And at this point, it's her fourth marriage. So, or it's her third marriage, but still. And she has children. She actually has a son with Brian Boru, who we'll talk about a little bit later. So she has Cedric Selkenbeard, her son from her marriage to the King of Dublin, and then she has another son from Brian Boru as well. So the stories tell us that, you know, Mal Morda was a little upset, though, that his sister had been divorced, that he kind of took it as an insult. And so while he was at Brian Boru's court to pay homage and to submit tribute in the form of cattle, he was apparently playing a board game with one of Brian's sons, not his own nephew, but a different one of Brian's sons. And during this board game, apparently the son insulted Maul in some way, shape, and form. And this insult was just too much for Maul to bear. And so he convinces his nephew, Cedric, the King of Dublin still, to revolt against Brian's rule a second time. I don't feel like this story is enough to explain why Mal Morda would have revolted against the High King of Ireland, who has so much power. He actually forced the other High King of Ireland to submit to him. There's probably something more that's going on about that. But this is the story that we get, is that Gormlaith was upset about being divorced, and that Mal Morda was insulted during a board game by one of Brian's sons. But that's the stories that we have. So together, Mal Morda and Cedric, the King of Dublin, they bring together their different naval forces, and they start to attack Brian's territories along the coastal region. So almost sort of reviving that Viking hit and run sort of raid style. And they're undermining his ability to trade. So again, these port cities that they're attacking are sources of trade, and by attacking them, they're making them not as easy to use. So in response to this, Brian lays siege to Dublin in 1013, and for 4 months he leads. He's sieging the city of Dublin, but unfortunately he has to leave because it's the winter months. He can't support his army. And knowing that Brian has all of these forces that are waiting to come back in the next fighting season, Mal Morda and Cedric start looking for support from other Vikings in this world. So they start asking for support from Vikings in England, back in Norway, back in York, the other kingship up there. They get support from Sigurd Holvitson, who is the king of the Orkneys at this time. He arrives. We have a ruler from the Hebrides that also joins. But of course, this other ruler, this other Cedric, he agrees to join them in battle against Brian only if Gormlaith will marry him. And to seal this deal, apparently Gormlaith agrees to this marriage alliance. So we start seeing different Viking forces kind of converging on Dublin at this point. And we have another one of Cedric's allies, King Sven Forkbeard of Denmark, has actually just defeated the King of England, this King Ethelred the Unready. If anyone knows anything about history, Ethelred was definitely unready and not prepared to keep the throne. And so not only is Brian Boru dealing with a revolt happening in Ireland against his rule, but he's now aware that the Vikings in England have overthrown the High King of England, essentially, and have now taken that throne. So there's just kind of this threat of these renewed Danish attacks. And is it the beginning of this large-scale Viking invasion? What's going to come of it? So Brian's kind of wrapped up in something greater than what's just politically happening in Ireland at this time. After the winter season has passed, Brian does bring his troops back. So on Good Friday, April 23rd, 1014, Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland, surrounded by his Irish subjects and the Vikings of Waterford and Limerick who had allied with him, approach Dublin, and they encounter the men of Leinster standing beside their Viking allies from Dublin, as well as other Vikings from other various areas that have agreed to join them. And they meet at the Battle of Clontarf. Now, Clontarf is located just north of Dublin Bay by about 1.5 miles from the present-day city center. And so this mix of Irish and Viking on both sides is really a typical mixed bag of alliances at this point. The Hiberno-Norse was really a part of the Irish political system now, and just can't avoid getting involved in it. Now, this battle, this great melee that takes place, sees Viking fighting Viking, Irish against Irish, Irish fighting Viking, and it results in several thousand deaths. And it's actually an exceptionally large battle for Ireland at this time. We don't know the exact numbers, so we can't say that it was the largest, but it was a very large battle. And unfortunately for Brian Boru, He's in his 70s at this point, so doesn't actually engage in the battle himself. He's in a tent overlooking the battle, praying for victory, apparently, is what we're told. Brian Borough's army wins, and Mal Morda, the king of Leinster, is killed. And most of the Vikings, after Mal Morda, their leader, had been kind of killed, a lot of the Vikings take to their boats and they retreat. And so they kind of abandon the Vikings in Dublin. Now, Brian doesn't get to celebrate because legend says that one of these Orkney Vikings snuck into his tent after the battle had been lost and actually cuts Brian and kills him in his tent in a very unmanly way. And the story that we're told is told through the lens of people who are trying to get Brian Burroughs canonized, trying to get him to be a saint. So one of the stories that we get tells us that the lad, one of his helpers, threw his arm in the way of the murderous Viking, and the stroke of the sword took off this arm and the king's head at the same time, but that the blood from the king's head came upon the lad's stump, and the stump healed on the spot. So they're claiming that Brian's blood in the moment of his death has healing properties. So it's kind of important, but it makes sense with that canonization that's happening. And I realize it is 4:15. I'm going to wrap this up really quickly, and then we'll have a little bit more time for questions, okay? So the Battle of Clontarf in legend has become this very famous battle in Irish history. It's painted as part of this national struggle of the Irish expelling the pagan Viking invader. But I hope by this point we can kind of understand that it wasn't really about that, that at this point the Hiberno-Norse were really just a part of Ireland at this point. They were valued members of society. They brought wealth into the area. They ran the ports. They ran the international trade. And so it's really less of this Irish struggle. And again, most of these Vikings aren't pagan at this point. The majority of the ones that they're fighting against are Christian because their mothers were Christian and they're just a part of that culture now. But the Battle of Clontarf isn't really the time that the Vikings are in complete decline, because I mentioned earlier, in the 980s, we start seeing the Vikings declining. And so, and already being absorbed into the Irish population. So the Battle of Clontarf wasn't really as important as it's said to be. But what it does is it marks the failed attempt of Leinster and Dublin to assert their independence from Munster, from Brian Boru. So it's this failed attempt. Now, Cedric Silkenbeard survives the battle, and he's allowed to continue on as King of Dublin for almost 2 decades afterwards. So he rules for a very long time. In 1028, Cedric actually goes on pilgrimage to Rome, which shows just how incredibly Christian he is at this point, even though he's still like a Viking king of an area. And his mother, Gormlaith, we don't know in the records if she ended up marrying that Viking ruler from the Orkneys, but she continues to live. She outlives all of the husbands, and she dies in 1030. So she lives a really long life. But after the Battle of Clontarf, obviously Brian has been brutally executed or murdered in his tent, and his forces are really depleted after this battle. His son and chosen heir, so his eldest son, was actually killed in battle, and because Brian was also killed in battle, Mal Schnall, remember that king of Meath who had split the high kingship and taken the northern half, he's able to reclaim the high kingship of Ireland after this, because there's really no personality that's strong enough in Brian's family to take on that role or fight against Mal Schnall as he takes it. Brian's position as the king of Munster is still secure, and he's succeeded by his son, Don Clad, who is Brian's son by Gormlaith. So Gormlaith's son, Don Clad, is now the king of Munster, and her other son is still the king of Dublin. So she's done pretty well by herself. And Dunlad actually reigns for about 50 years. And by 1119, so maybe about a century after the Battle of Clontarf, the family, the Dulles Keys that they had originally been known as, start sporting the name O'Brien, and that's where we get the family surname O'Brien, is from Brian Boru. Now I'm going to quickly talk about the major impacts. I think I've kind of talked about this already, so I don't have to go over it too much. But the impacts of the Viking invasions on Ireland are exponential. Not only does it bring Ireland into international trade that they've never been a part of, it brings them into the world that they've never introduced because they were untouched by the Romans. Start seeing the development of internal commerce, and more cities are developing that aren't focused on a monastery. Those port cities that the Vikings founded continue to flourish and become important factors in Irish commerce and the economy there. But there's also a number of other ways that the Vikings influenced Ireland. In ways of warfare, we start seeing different warfare tactics on the battlefield. Um, the types of armor that the Irish start wearing have more of a reflection of the Vikings, that they're using more metal. But we also see changes in artwork. Remember, I was talking about the Hiberno Norse, kind of that blending of art forms, especially in jewelry making, that's important. But we see differences in building structures, the way that things are being built in the countryside. Different Scandinavian words are becoming a normal part of the Irish Gaelic language as well. And when I'm talking about buildings changing, I want to point something out real quickly here. So on this slide here, I have a picture of Clonmanoise, and you'll see this tall tower here. These towers were not built in Ireland before the Viking invasions. They were built in response to Viking attacks on monasteries. So there are these very tall towers that all of the monks could then seek refuge in, and they would pull up the ladders so that the Vikings couldn't get in. And so we start seeing changes in the way the architecture in Ireland is being built because of the invasions, but then also the different styles of the Scandinavian building processes. We see the use of coinage being introduced into Ireland for the first time. Our favorite king of Dublin, Cedric Silkenbeard, mints the first coins in Ireland in the 990s. And you can actually see on this slide as well, these are some of the first coins that he minted that have still survived to today. And you can see the Christian cross on there, but then also an image of himself in the Roman fashion. And the inscription reads Cedric, King of Dublin on there. And so this is our first coinage that's being used. And also Cedric Silkenbeard founds Christ Church, which is one of the most beautiful churches in Dublin proper. And he founds that in 1030. But we also see changes in society through just the way that the Vikings are being introduced into the Irish family unit, that Hiberno Norse combining of these different powers, and their cultures and their religions are also just sort of shaping the Irish as much as the Irish are shaping these Viking invaders. Dublin continues to be a huge port and trading base, not just for the Vikings, but also for the other Irish that start using this for more of an economy that is being built there. But we do see Ireland being brought more into this greater world after the Vikings had invaded. And so the Vikings really do kind of bring Ireland a little bit more up to date with the rest of the world. And again, Ireland wasn't as affected by these Viking raids, culturally speaking, because they were already quite a culture that had a lot of raids already. There was a lot of clan warfare. And so the Vikings were kind of just seen as another clan that was raiding. Okay, so I'm going to stop my lecture here because I realize I've gone over a little bit. I added more to my Viking lecture, and I obviously did not cut enough out. So I haven't gotten a chance to talk about the Vikings who then used Ireland as a springboard to colonize Iceland, to colonize Greenland, the ones who supposedly went over to North America as well.